Thank you, David, Philip, and distinguished guests all. In facing an audience, though, here in Wellington, my home region, I must admit to having a fair degree of anxiety and trepidation, because I'm feeling a wee bit like the 8th husband of Elizabeth Taylor on their wedding night. I know what to do here, but how am I going to make it interesting? So I thought it would be interesting if I started, this is all about inspire, but I thought I should start talking about failure first and then build on that. And I thought, in preparing for today, what are some of the common phrases that I've heard over several decades of business? And so I would like to share that common phrase with you, and also in doing that, hopefully that will inspire, as Phil said and David, particularly the young people in the audience, to seek better and bigger and brighter things. So if I start off first by talking about failure, I grew up in Petone, educated in Petone. When I got to about age 13, when most boys in particular are learning about gunpowder and guns and so on, my father, who had been on Gallipoli and in the artillery, then the Somme, because of that experience, refused to let me have gunpowder or make it or experiment with guns. So at age 13, I was reading a magazine called Popular Mechanics. And in Popular Mechanics, they had a diagram of an atomic bomb. And I looked at that and I thought, this is not gunpowder, so I would try making an atomic bomb. So the local pharmacist in Petone was someone that I always bought chemicals from. He would even sell things like potassium and sodium, all kinds of acids. He was more than a pharmacist. He kind of looked after local kids and their chemical experiments. So imagine a 13-year-old going into the pharmacy and saying, look, I'm going to build an atomic bomb. And there's this stuff in here called uranium. And I've been buying stuff in here, but do you have any uranium that I can use to make this atomic bomb? To the credit of the pharmacist, he didn't break into any smile or roll about laughing. He said, no, actually, there was no uranium around these days. And so, but maybe lead might work. So he brought out this chart, which he called the periodic table. And he said, look, uranium is in here, I think it's 235. And if you look just up here, you'll see lead, which is, I think, 95 or thereabouts. And he said, look, they're quite close together. Although I can't give you uranium, lead might work. I said, that's a good idea. He said, you'll probably get a little explosion, not 100 megatons. And I can just imagine what he was thinking. This damn kid is trying to blow up Petone. So I then spent the next probably 3 or 4 weeks at the Petone dump, finding as many lead-head nails as I could, stripping the lead off flashing of old pieces of roofing iron, melting it down with a blowtorch, and got a piece of lead about as big as a tennis ball. I cut this in half, got caps from a cap gun, loaded the whole thing into a piece of steam pipe, jammed wood at each end, and that was the atomic bomb. Now, I was a smart 13-year-old because I thought, how am I going to set this off? If I hit it with the hammer and it goes off, it's only going to, I'm history. So the best thing to do is I would drop it from the roof of our house in Petone onto the concrete pathway, and at least I'll be sheltered from the explosion when it goes off. So I spent about 3 weeks climbing up the roof, up to the gable, and then dropping this piece of steam pipe onto the path below. And all that happened is the gunpowder went off, there was a bit of a pop, and that was it. So I went back to the pharmacist and said, look, this wasn't working. So this was a glorious failure in the atomic bomb. And so the pharmacist said, well, look, maybe you won't be a nuclear physicist, but look, what about the stuff called electronics and radio? And I thought, he said, that's an alternative. So he gave me some wire, he gave me some components for a crystal set and showed me how to wind a coil. He gave me some old headphones, showed me how to make a detector out of a piece of coal and a razor blade. And so that was 13 and a half or thereabouts. And I never forget that first experience of putting on the headphones and hearing music from something that I'd been able to make. The thing got 6 radio stations all at once, but that was beside the point. So out of that glorious failure, I had learned quite a bit. As the years rolled by, I got to be dux of the local high school and went to university at age 17. I had no brothers or sisters, and you can probably guess what happened. In the first year of engineering intermediate here at Victoria, I learned all about drinking alcohol. I made the New Zealand University's judo team, and I found some wonderful people or creatures called girls. So for a 17-year-old coming into that cocktail mix, you can imagine what happened. I failed every unit in that year, another glorious failure. I had a public service scholarship at the time, and I remember the words, Neville, you're never going to make it through university, you can't do that, you'll go and be a telecommunications technician. And that to me seemed to be giving up all too easily. So I did a certificate in engineering, did quite well, and got accelerated entry into Canterbury University and caught up with my peers. So out of 2 failures came the impetus to go and apply myself properly and to also figure out my place, what I thought might be my place in the world. After graduation, I got a scholarship to go back and do a master's. My then boss in civil aviation, which was then became part of the Ministry of Transport, said, no, you can't go back and do a master's. We want you to be working. About a year after that, I got a scholarship to go to the Imperial College in London. My boss again said, no, you can't do that. After about 3 years, my student bond was coming down and my salary was going up and the areas under the curve became equal. And at that point, I got a Rotary scholarship to go to the USA and fetched up at the Apollo Mission Control Center in Houston, right at the time of Apollo 13. So here were a lot of young people, not too much older than me, under huge stress, but having what seemed a lot of fun at the time. And I stored that away and thought, I need to be much more involved in science and technology. So when I came back, I said to my boss in civil aviation that I was going to leave, I was going to get more involved in science and technology. And I can still hear his words ringing like pieces of 8 in Treasure Island. That'll never work, you're leaving a lifetime job here, you're going to go to IBM, they'll chew you up and spit you out, that's never going to work. So I did it anyway. After 4 years in IBM, I had always this inkling of starting my own company. So after 4 years, I went to my then boss and said, look, I need to resign. I'd like to start my own company. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I've got $2,000. That's all I had as capital. I didn't have an MBA, so I didn't understand undercapitalisation. So my boss said, you can't do that. You've got everything here in IBM. You've got had a good career starting. It's never going to work. I said, okay, but I resigned on a Friday, and on the Monday, I opened for business. No telephone, and I started literally in a bedroom of my mother's house in Petone. So for a few years, she put up with fumes of soldering, very late nights for me doing design of telecommunications equipment, mostly for defence in the early days. And neighbours said to her, what on earth is Neville doing? You know, why doesn't he get a proper job? This is never going to work out. Anyway, the years rolled on, and by the mid-90s, We had a staff of about 250 people, a revenue of well over $100 million, and in the 20-odd years prior to that, right from start-up to that period, we had never made a loss. And it was very clear that if we were going to keep expanding in this business, we needed more capital. So I spoke to the folks at the NZX, the New Zealand Stock Exchange, and I said, look, I think it's time that there was a technology company listed on the stock exchange in New Zealand. And they said, oh, no, it's high risk, that'll never work out. I spoke to a couple of brokers and they said exactly the same thing. So, damn it. So exactly as David said, I dialed the international directory number and spoke to the NASDAQ head office in Washington, DC, and after the usual, God damn, what time is it there? What's the temperature? And I told them what I was after. They said, yeah, come on over. I don't think they really knew where New Zealand was. So the following week, went to the NASDAQ headquarters, talked about the company, and a year or so later, we had a really successful listing, an IPO on the main board of the NASDAQ. And here, people said it couldn't be done. About 2 years after the listing, we got approached by a larger US company, and they said, hey, you guys are a threat to us, and we're a threat to you. We should do an amalgamation. And so that seemed like a good deal, and we remained on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange. The Securities Exchange Commission in the US approved the amalgamation of a New Zealand company, a US company, both listed on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange within 30 days. Here in New Zealand, I spoke to the officials and said, look, we want to do an amalgamation with a US company. And they said, no, no one's done that before. That wouldn't work, you couldn't do that. But they said, look, we'll get back to you. And I said, okay. So we went ahead and did the amalgamation anyway under US law. And the officials never could get back. But I think to give them credit, they actually lost my phone number. So there was another case of it can't be done. After being able to cash out from the float, I formed a venture capital fund using my own cash. Then a bit later, a second fund which was using government money from a license that we got. And shortly after the GFC, I was designing another fund. But here in New Zealand, people said, no, you can't put a fund together anymore, particularly something based on science and technology. And I said, but I'd like to list this. They said, no, there won't be much interest in that. You can't do that, that won't work out. So this, I stewed on this because once again, the phrase, you can't do that, it won't work. I happened to see about 18 months ago where New Zealand was looking at other small countries like Ireland, Israel, Singapore, Denmark. Interestingly, they left out Scotland. However, the point was there were all kinds of benchmarks running, all kinds of commentary on small countries. And yet nothing was done about it. So I thought, what can I do? How can I become enmeshed in another culture that is really going forward? Someone who embraces, or a country rather, that is similar, has a similar background to New Zealand, and yet seems to be doing so much better. And that country was Denmark. It happens that they had a very dynamic stock exchange. So I called their stock exchange and said what we'd like to do. That would be to list an investment company on their stock exchange. And they said, sure, only too pleased to do that. Here, people had said no, it would never work. So it's taken about 18 months of work, but in around about 3 weeks' time, we will have a listed investment company on the stock exchange in London. And here, people said, you can't do it. So my point is that I think that as we go along in life, in our careers, we almost have to listen to that little voice inside, not take notice of all the naysayers who are saying, that won't work, you can't do that. Because all of us have a little voice of self-confidence inside, as long as we have the confidence itself to listen to that little voice inside. The suggestion that I have then as a takeaway is to put aside the people who are always too happy to be negative, who've quite often not done anything themselves and yet are only too willing to say that won't work or you can't do that. And it goes back almost to a principle of judo. In judo, it's the use of opposing force to your own benefit. And so the opposing force are those that would deny that something can be done, and yet it can be if you use that force to your own advantage. So I'd like to conclude there, out of 2 abject failures and using opposing force, then quite a lot of success has come out. And I am, though, very grateful to many, many people in New Zealand who have been very, very supportive along the way. Philip.